I stared at those numbers on my computer monitor at 2:17 in the morning, and everything inside me turned to lead. 12%. Our quarterly projections were inflated by 12 whole percent, and I was the only analyst who'd caught it because I'd been running cross-checks that nobody else bothered with anymore. Bradley Hutchinson had submitted these numbers. Our vice president of strategic development, the man who'd hired me 18 months ago with promises about integrity and transparency in financial reporting. The same man who'd looked me dead in the eye during last week's team meeting and said, "Accuracy is everything in this business, people. One wrong number can destroy careers." I sat there in that empty office building. Ceiling lights flickered faintly, casting a sterile glow, knowing I held something that could ruin him. But I also knew that if I reported this immediately, he'd find a way to blame me. He always did. Bradley had this talent for making other people responsible for his mistakes, and I'd watched him do it to 3 different colleagues over the past year. So I didn't report it. Not yet. Instead, I started watching him. Really watching him. During our weekly budget reviews, I noticed how he questioned every single department's expenditures, except one area: consulting fees paid to external contractors. When anyone brought up those particular line items, he'd quickly redirect the conversation or claim he'd review them privately later. I spent 3 weeks documenting his patterns. How he always scheduled his private meetings during lunch when most staff were away. How he insisted on personally approving all contractor payments above $5,000. How he'd grown defensive whenever our CFO asked about the consulting budget during monthly reviews. Before I dive deeper, could you please take a few seconds to tell me in the comments where you're listening from? Because I want to know where my story is reaching. And please like, subscribe, and hit the bell for notifications, because stories like this don't stay buried forever, and I want to make sure you catch what happens next. My name is Cassandra, and what I'm about to tell you changed everything about how I see corporate power and the people who think they're untouchable. 3 weeks after discovering those inflated numbers, I made a decision that terrified me. I was going to present Bradley's false projections at the next board meeting, exactly as he'd submitted them, and wait for him to react. I knew Bradley's personality by then. He was brilliant, absolutely brilliant, but he had this compulsive need to be the smartest person in every room. He couldn't stand being wrong, and he especially couldn't stand when someone else might know something he didn't. I'd seen him interrupt presentations just to show off his knowledge of details that weren't even relevant to the discussion. The board meeting was scheduled for Thursday morning, 9:30 sharp. I spent the entire week preparing my presentation, making sure every slide perfectly reflected the inflated numbers Bradley had given me. I practiced my delivery until I could present those false projections with complete confidence. Wednesday night, I barely slept. Not because I was nervous about lying to the board. I wasn't lying, I was simply presenting what had been officially submitted to me. But because I knew that if this plan failed, if Bradley didn't take the bait, I'd be the one standing in front of 12 board members with obviously incorrect financial data. Thursday morning arrived gray and drizzling. I got to the office an hour early, printed my presentation materials, and sat in the parking lot gathering courage. At 9:15, I walked into that conference room, where 12 of the most powerful people in our company were already seated around an enormous oval table. Bradley sat 3 chairs down from the head of the table, wearing his expensive navy suit and that confident smile he always wore when he thought he was about to win something. He nodded at me as I entered, completely unaware that I was carrying dynamite disguised as quarterly projections. "Good morning, everyone," said our CEO, a sharp woman named Diana Frost who'd built this company from nothing over 20 years. "Cassandra will be presenting our Q3 financial analysis this morning." I stood up, activated the projector, and began. For the first 10 minutes, everything went smoothly. I presented revenue streams, expense categories, and market comparisons exactly as Bradley had calculated them. Several board members took notes. A few asked clarifying questions that I answered confidently. Then I reached the profit projection slide. Based on our current trajectory and the data provided by strategic development, I said, looking directly at the numbers on the screen, we're projecting an 18% increase in net profits for Q4. That's when Bradley shot up from his chair like someone had electrocuted him. That's completely wrong, he said, his voice cutting across the room. He pointed his finger directly at me, and I felt every pair of eyes in that room turn my direction. She's lying about our profits. Those numbers are totally inflated. The room went completely silent. I mean, absolutely silent. You could have heard someone's heartbeat in that moment. I took a deep breath, looked at Bradley with the calmest expression I could manage, and smiled. How would you know the real numbers unless you've been accessing confidential preliminary audits that only 3 people have clearance for? I watched Bradley's face change. It was like watching someone realize they'd just walked off a cliff. His mouth opened slightly, then closed. His eyes darted around the room, taking in the expressions of 12 board members who were all suddenly very interested in how he knew information he shouldn't have access to. But I wasn't finished. Not even close. Actually, I continued, my voice steady despite my heart hammering against my ribs, since you clearly have access to the real figures, perhaps you'd like to explain why your consulting subsidiary has been billing us for services that mysteriously align with every budget surplus we've had this year? The silence in that room became something you could touch. Diana Frost's eyes narrowed as she looked from me to Bradley and back again. Other board members started flipping through their packets, looking for something they'd missed. Bradley's face went through what I can only describe as emotional gymnastics. Confusion, then realization, then panic, then desperate calculation as he tried to figure out how much I actually knew versus how much I was guessing. I don't know what you're implying, he said, but his voice had lost all its earlier confidence. I was simply pointing out mathematical errors in the presentation. Mathematical errors, I repeated slowly, in numbers that came directly from your department, numbers that you personally reviewed and approved before they were submitted to me. I reached into my folder and pulled out a document that I'd prepared the night before. This is your email from 2 weeks ago, confirming these exact projections and instructing me to present them to the board without modifications. Bradley stared at that email printout like it might burst into flames, because he was trapped, and he knew it. If he admitted the numbers were wrong, he was confessing to submitting false financial data. If he insisted they were correct, then he couldn't explain how he knew they were inflated. But here's the thing about Bradley that I'd learned from watching him for 3 weeks. He couldn't help himself. His ego was bigger than his survival instinct. Even cornered, even caught, he still needed to prove he was the smartest person in that room. Those numbers are wrong because I have access to preliminary audit data that shows our actual financial position, he said, his voice rising with frustration. I know what our real profits look like, and they're not anywhere near what she's presenting. Diana Frost leaned forward in her chair. Bradley, preliminary audit data is restricted to myself, our CFO, and our external audit firm. How exactly do you have access to that information? And that's when I saw something beautiful happen. Bradley realized what he'd just admitted. Not only had he confessed to unauthorized access of restricted financial documents, but he'd done it while trying to make me look incompetent. The board voted for an immediate forensic audit before we even left that conference room. Diana Frost suspended Bradley pending investigation, effective immediately. Security escorted him out of the building while the rest of us sat there in stunned silence. But what happened over the next 3 days changed everything I thought I knew about revenge, justice, and how sometimes the perfect trap is simply giving someone enough rope to hang themselves. The forensic accountants arrived Monday morning. By Tuesday afternoon, they'd found the shell companies. By Wednesday, they'd traced 18 months of elaborate billing schemes where Bradley had been paying himself through fake consulting contracts. By Thursday, they'd calculated that he'd stolen over $400,000 from our company. The most beautiful part? I never had to investigate him. I never had to gather evidence or build a case. His psychological need to publicly demonstrate superior knowledge had exposed his entire operation. He literally could not help himself from proving he knew things he shouldn't know. Friday morning, I got called into Diana Frost's office. I thought I was going to be fired for presenting false data, even though technically I'd only presented what had been officially submitted to me. Instead, she offered me Bradley's job. You showed remarkable intuition and strategic thinking, she said. Anyone can catch mathematical errors. It takes real insight to understand human psychology well enough to let someone destroy themselves. I accepted the promotion, but what happened the following week taught me something about revenge that I never expected to learn. Monday morning, I moved into Bradley's old office. Same view of the city skyline, same leather chair that still smelled faintly of his expensive cologne. His personal items were gone, but he'd left behind files, business cards, and a calendar that told stories about meetings I'd never known about. That's when I found the first letter. It was tucked inside a folder marked Personal Development, a handwritten note on expensive stationery that made my blood freeze. The letter was from Bradley's wife, thanking him for covering their daughter's medical expenses. Their 8-year-old daughter, who'd been undergoing treatment for leukemia for the past 2 years. I sat in that chair, holding that letter, realizing that the $400,000 Bradley had stolen hadn't gone to fancy cars or gambling debts. It had gone to save his child's life. The next letter was from a specialist in Boston, detailing experimental treatment options that their insurance wouldn't cover. $23,000 per round of treatment. The third letter was from a medical loan company, explaining why their application had been denied due to existing debt. I spent that entire first week in Bradley's office, reading through a hidden file of medical bills, insurance denials, and desperate correspondence with treatment centers across the country. This man hadn't been living some secret luxury lifestyle. He'd been drowning in medical debt, watching his daughter fight for her life, while our company's health insurance plan found creative ways to deny coverage for experimental treatments. By Friday, I understood exactly why Bradley had created those shell companies. Every single payment aligned perfectly with his daughter's treatment schedule. He'd been stealing from the company to save his child, and I'd destroyed him for it. The realization hit me like physical nausea. I'd been so focused on Bradley's arrogance, his need to be right, his condescending attitude toward me, that I'd never considered what might be driving him. I'd played psychological chess with a desperate father and won by exposing his attempts to save his dying daughter. That weekend, I couldn't eat. I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about Bradley's face in that board meeting. Not just the moment he realized he'd been caught, but the deeper exhaustion I'd seen in his eyes that I'd misinterpreted as arrogance. The man had been carrying the weight of his child's potential death while maintaining a professional facade, and I'd used his psychological breaking point against him. Monday of the second week, our CFO, Margaret Chen, knocked on my office door with an update on the investigation. The forensic accountants had finished their analysis. Bradley faced federal charges for embezzlement, fraud, and wire fraud. Minimum sentence would be 8 to 10 years in federal prison. There's something else, Margaret said, settling into the chair across from my new desk. Bradley's attorney contacted our legal department this morning. They want to arrange a plea bargain. What kind of plea bargain? Full restitution plus interest, in exchange for dropping the federal charges. Apparently, Bradley's wife has been liquidating their assets. They can cover about 60% immediately, with a payment plan for the remainder. I stared out the window at the city skyline, thinking about an 8-year-old girl whose father might spend the next decade in prison because I'd been clever enough to trigger his desperate need to protect her. What's our position on the plea bargain? I asked. Diana wants to pursue full prosecution. She says we need to send a message about corporate theft. Margaret paused, studying my expression. But the decision ultimately comes down to you, since you're the one who uncovered the fraud. Your recommendation carries significant weight with the board. That night, I drove to Bradley's house for the first time. I'd looked up his address in the company directory, but I'd never actually seen where he lived. It was a modest 2-story house in a middle-class neighborhood, with a wheelchair ramp leading up to the front door and medical equipment visible through the living room window. I sat in my car across the street for 2 hours, watching lights move through different rooms. At one point, I saw Bradley himself, thinner than I remembered, wearing a faded t-shirt instead of his usual expensive suits. He was carrying what looked like medication from one room to another. Then I saw her, his daughter. Even from a distance, I could tell she was sick. She moved slowly, carefully, like every step required effort. Bradley helped her to a chair by the window, and they sat together looking out at the street. He was reading to her from a book, and even though I couldn't hear the words, I could see how gently he held her, how carefully he turned each page. I drove home that night knowing I had to make a choice that would define who I really was. Not who I'd been in that board meeting when I'd been focused on justice and vindication, but who I was when faced with the full complexity of human desperation. Tuesday morning, I called Bradley's attorney and arranged a meeting for that afternoon. I didn't tell anyone at the company what I was planning because I honestly didn't know myself. The attorney's office was downtown, 30 floors up in a glass tower that overlooked the harbor. Bradley's lawyer was a tired-looking woman named Patricia Holbrook, who clearly specialized in white-collar defense for people who couldn't afford the expensive firms. "My client deeply regrets his actions," she began, but I interrupted her. "I want to hear from him directly." She called Bradley, and 20 minutes later, he walked into that conference room looking like a completely different person from the confident executive who'd accused me of lying 3 weeks earlier. He'd lost weight, his expensive suits had been replaced by department store clothing, and there were dark circles under his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and medical emergency runs. We sat across from each other at a small conference table, and for the first time since I'd known him, Bradley looked genuinely vulnerable. "I know you hate me," he said quietly, "and I know I deserve whatever happens next, but I need you to understand that every dollar I took went directly to keeping my daughter alive." "Tell me about her," I said. For the next hour, Bradley told me about Emma, how she'd been diagnosed with acute lymphoblastic leukemia 2 weeks after her 6th birthday, how their insurance company had approved standard treatment protocols but denied coverage for the experimental therapies that offered her the best chance of survival, how he'd spent months fighting appeals and denials while watching his daughter grow weaker. "I started with the consulting payments because I told myself it was temporary," he said, "just until the insurance company approved the experimental treatment, but they kept finding new reasons to deny coverage, and Emma kept needing more rounds of therapy. Why didn't you come to the company for help? We have hardship programs, medical leave options." Bradley laughed bitterly. "I tried that first. Do you know what our hardship program offers for catastrophic medical expenses? $5,000 maximum, and only if you can prove genuine financial need. Emma's treatment costs more than that every 2 weeks." He pulled out his phone and showed me a photo. Emma before she got sick, a little girl with bright eyes and long brown hair, wearing a soccer uniform and grinning at the camera. Then, another photo from last month. The same little girl, bald from chemotherapy, but still smiling despite the exhaustion in her eyes. "The worst part is that it's working," Bradley said. "The experimental treatment is working. Her latest scans show significant improvement. But now that I've been caught, now that I'm probably going to prison, we can't afford to continue the therapy." I stared at those photos, understanding finally that my perfect revenge had been perfectly cruel. I'd destroyed a desperate father who'd been stealing to save his dying child, and in doing so, I'd potentially sentenced that child to death. "What happens to Emma if you go to prison?" I asked. "My wife will have to declare bankruptcy. We'll lose the house, lose access to Emma's current medical team, probably have to move in with her parents in another state. Emma will have to start over with new doctors who don't know her case, assuming we can even find doctors who'll take Medicaid patients for experimental treatments." Bradley looked directly at me then, and I saw something in his eyes that made my chest tighten. Not anger, not resentment, but resignation. Like he'd already accepted that saving his daughter had cost him everything, and he was at peace with that trade. "I don't expect forgiveness," he said. "I stole from the company, I betrayed everyone's trust, and I put you in an impossible position by lying about those numbers. But I want you to know that every single dollar went to giving my daughter a chance to live." I left that meeting with my whole understanding of justice turned upside down. I'd thought I was fighting corruption and holding someone accountable for fraud. Instead, I'd uncovered a father's desperate attempt to save his child's life, and my perfect psychological trap had destroyed his ability to continue that fight. That night, I made a decision that surprised everyone, including myself. Wednesday morning, I walked into Diana Frost's office and requested a private meeting. She was reviewing quarterly reports when I knocked, her reading glasses perched on her nose, looking every bit the successful CEO who'd built this company through decades of tough decisions. "Cassandra, please sit down. I assume this is about the Bradley situation?" "It is. I want to recommend that we accept the plea bargain." Diana removed her glasses and studied my face carefully. That's unexpected. Yesterday you seemed convinced that prosecution was the right path forward. I've learned some things about Bradley's situation that changed my perspective. I told her everything. About Emma's leukemia, about the medical bills, about the insurance denials and the experimental treatments. I showed her copies of the medical documentation I'd found in Bradley's office, and I watched her expression shift from skepticism to concern to something that looked almost like pain. "This doesn't excuse what he did," Diana said finally. "Theft is theft, regardless of motivation." "You're right, but prosecution won't recover our money any faster than restitution will. And destroying Bradley's family won't serve any purpose beyond satisfying our desire for punishment." Diana was quiet for several minutes, turning this information over in her mind. "What exactly are you proposing?" "Full restitution with interest, as his attorney suggested. But I want to add conditions. Bradley provides a complete breakdown of how every stolen dollar was spent, with medical documentation. He submits to monthly financial audits for the next 3 years. And he performs 200 hours of community service at a nonprofit that helps families navigate medical bankruptcy. And in exchange, we drop all criminal charges and provide a neutral employment reference that doesn't mention the theft. He gets a chance to rebuild his life and continue supporting his daughter's treatment." Diana leaned back in her chair, considering this proposal. "The board will want to know why you're advocating for leniency towards someone who betrayed your trust professionally." "Because I realized that my perfect revenge was actually perfect cruelty," I said. "I triggered Bradley's psychological weaknesses to expose his crimes, but I never considered what drove him to commit those crimes in the first place. A father watching his child die will do things that a rational person would never consider." "And you think showing mercy makes us look weak?" "I think showing mercy when we have the power to destroy someone shows strength. Anyone can pursue maximum punishment when they hold all the cards. It takes real leadership to choose justice over vengeance." Diana approved my recommendation that afternoon. The board voted unanimously to accept the plea bargain, with the conditions I'd proposed. Bradley's attorney called me personally to express gratitude, though Bradley himself remained notably absent from all communication. Thursday morning, I was settling into my new routine when Margaret Chen knocked on my office door again. "There's someone here to see you," she said. "Bradley's wife, Catherine. She doesn't have an appointment, but she says it's important." I told Margaret to send her up, though I wasn't sure what to expect from this conversation. Catherine Hutchinson turned out to be a small woman with prematurely gray hair and hands that shook slightly, the kind of exhaustion that comes from months of sleeping in hospital chairs and fighting insurance companies. "I wanted to thank you personally," she said, settling into the chair across from my desk. "Patricia told me that you were the one who recommended the plea bargain." "I'm sorry about everything your family has been through," I said, "with Emma's illness and now this situation with Bradley." Catherine smiled sadly. "You know, 6 months ago, I would have told you that my husband was the most honest man I'd ever met. He wouldn't even keep extra change when cashiers made mistakes. But watching your child suffer changes you in ways you can't imagine until you're living it." "How is Emma doing?" "Better, actually. The experimental treatment has been incredibly effective. Her latest scans show that the cancer is in remission, though she'll need ongoing monitoring for the next several years." Catherine paused, looking out the window. "Bradley told me about your board meeting, about how you figured out what he'd been doing. I'm not proud of how I handled that situation." "You should be," Catherine said, surprising me. "Bradley needed to be stopped, but not just because he was stealing. He was destroying himself with guilt and desperation. He barely slept, barely ate, spent every waking moment terrified that he'd be caught before Emma finished her treatment." She reached into her purse and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "Emma wrote you a letter. She doesn't understand everything that happened, but she knows that you made it possible for Bradley to come home instead of going to prison." I unfolded the letter, written in careful 8-year-old handwriting on construction paper decorated with crayon drawings of flowers and butterflies. "Dear Cassandra, thank you for helping my daddy come home. I was scared he would have to go away for a long time. Daddy says you were very smart and very kind. I hope we can meet someday when I'm feeling better. Love, Emma." I had to set the letter down because my vision was getting blurry. This little girl was thanking me for showing mercy to her father, when 3 weeks ago I'd been focused solely on exposing his crimes. There's something else, Catherine said. Bradley wants to meet with you, but he's afraid you'll refuse. He's been working with a financial counselor to restructure our debt and set up the restitution payments. He wants to apologize properly, but he also wants to show you that he's taking full responsibility for what he did. I agreed to meet with Bradley the following week. We scheduled it for Saturday morning at a neutral location, a small cafe downtown that served breakfast and had quiet corners where people could have private conversations. Bradley arrived exactly on time, carrying a manila folder and looking more composed than I'd seen him since the board meeting. He'd gained back some weight, and while he still looked tired, there was something different in his posture. Less desperation, more determination. "Thank you for agreeing to see me," he said as we settled into a corner booth. "I know I have no right to ask for your time after everything that happened." "How are you doing, really?" "Honestly, better than I expected. The guilt was killing me slowly for months. Having everything out in the open, having a plan to make restitution, it's actually a relief." Bradley opened his folder and pulled out several documents. "I wanted to show you the payment schedule we've worked out and the financial counseling program I've enrolled in." He'd liquidated his retirement accounts, sold their second car, and arranged to sell their house to move into a smaller place. The restitution would be paid off in 18 months instead of the 3 years the plea agreement allowed. "I also wanted you to know that I've been volunteering at the nonprofit you suggested, the Medical Bankruptcy Support Group. I'm helping other families navigate insurance appeals and find resources for experimental treatments." "How has that been?" "Humbling. I met a single mother last week who's been fighting her insurance company for 8 months to cover her son's cancer treatment. I was able to help her find a legal advocacy group that got the denial overturned in 2 weeks." Bradley paused, stirring his coffee absently. "I realized that what I did, stealing from the company, it was selfish. There were other options I never explored because I was too proud to ask for help." "What do you mean?" "There are charitable foundations that help families with medical expenses, crowdfunding platforms where people share their stories and raise money, support groups where families share resources and strategies. I was so focused on maintaining our privacy and my professional reputation that I chose the most isolated, destructive path possible." Bradley looked directly at me then, and I saw something in his eyes that I hadn't seen during the board meeting or even during our conversation with his attorney. Genuine accountability. "I want you to know that I don't blame you for what happened in that board meeting. You were doing your job, and you were right to expose what I'd been doing. I put you in an impossible position by submitting false numbers, and then I tried to make you look incompetent when you presented them. I should have come to you directly when I first discovered the discrepancies." "No," Bradley said firmly. "You shouldn't have. I would have found a way to cover it up or blame someone else. I was too desperate and too prideful to handle direct confrontation rationally." He pulled out one more document from his folder. "This is something I've been working on with the financial counselor. A detailed breakdown of every dollar I took and exactly how it was spent. Medical bills, pharmacy receipts, travel expenses for treatment. I want complete transparency about where the money went." I looked through the documentation, page after page of medical expenses that painted a picture of desperate parents fighting to save their child. Every stolen dollar accounted for, every expense justified by Emma's treatment needs. "Why are you showing me this?" "Because I want you to understand that your decision to recommend the plea bargain didn't just save my family. It taught me that accountability doesn't have to mean destruction. That justice can include redemption if someone is willing to do the work." We talked for another hour about Emma's recovery, about Bradley's new job search, about the lessons we'd both learned from this experience. When we finally prepared to leave, Bradley extended his hand. "I know I can never fully make up for what I did to you professionally or personally, but I want you to know that your mercy changed my entire understanding of what it means to take responsibility for mistakes." I shook his hand, realizing that this conversation had changed my understanding too. 3 weeks ago, I'd thought justice meant exposing corruption and punishing wrongdoing. Now I understood that sometimes justice means creating space for people to rebuild after they've fallen. 6 months later, I received another letter from Emma. This one was typed on a computer, with better spelling and more sophisticated vocabulary. She told me about finishing third grade, about her hair growing back curly instead of straight, about the soccer team she'd joined for kids who'd survived serious illnesses. At the bottom of the letter, she'd included a photo of herself and Bradley at a charity walk for childhood cancer research. They were both wearing matching t-shirts that said "Survivors and Supporters," and Emma was holding a small trophy she'd won for raising the most money in her age group. I keep that photo on my desk now, next to the crayon drawing she'd sent with her first letter. It reminds me that revenge isn't always about destroying your enemies. Sometimes the most powerful revenge is choosing to help them become better people than they were when they hurt you. Bradley never became my friend, exactly, but he became something more valuable. He became an example of what accountability can look like when it's paired with genuine remorse and sustained effort to make things right. The most surprising part of this whole experience is that I learned more about myself than I learned about him. I discovered that I'm capable of both calculated psychological manipulation and genuine mercy, sometimes within the same situation. I learned that my need to be right can be just as destructive as Bradley's need to be smart if I'm not careful about how I use it. Most importantly, I learned that the best revenge stories aren't always about destruction. Sometimes they're about transformation, both for the person who was wronged and for the person who did the wronging. If this story resonated with you, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever been in a situation where you had to choose between punishment and mercy? Have you ever discovered that your understanding of justice was more complicated than you originally thought? Please like this video if it made you think differently about revenge and forgiveness, and subscribe for more real stories about the complex decisions we face when people betray our trust. And please hit that notification bell, because I have more stories about workplace betrayal, family secrets, and the moments that change how we see ourselves and the people around us.